The wind had teeth and it chewed on the land, spitting grit and dust into a sky the color of a bad bruise. Levi urged his horse on, a big roan gelding that was as tired as he was. The prairie stretched out in every direction, a merciless, sun-scorched canvas of brown and pale yellow that offered no comfort and no quarter. He tasted blood on his lips, though he could not tell if it was his own or just the iron-rich dust the storm kicked up. His left side was a dull, hot throb where a bullet had gouged a path through muscle and sinew 3 days ago. It was a shallow wound, but it was festering with dirt and sweat and the kind of exhaustion that settled deep in a man's bones. That pain was nothing. A flea bite. The real wound was deeper. A hollowed-out space in his chest where the faces of 2 good men, young men, flickered and died behind his eyes every time he blinked. He had led them into an ambush. He, who was supposed to be the seasoned one, the one who could read the land and the men on it. He had read it all wrong. He saw the glint of sun on a rifle barrel too late, heard the crack of the first shot a moment after the boy beside him had already fallen from his saddle. He had frozen. For a heartbeat, maybe 2. The world had gone silent and slow, and he had done nothing but watch it happen. The shame of that moment was a heavier burden than the heat, the dust, or the nagging fire in his side. Now, he rode toward another kind of reckoning. A woman, a name on a piece of paper he'd signed months ago in a fit of loneliness so profound it had felt like a sickness. Clara, a mail-order bride. He had sent the money, exchanged a few stilted letters, and then the cattle drive had come up. He'd put her out of his mind. Another chore to be dealt with later. But his world had burned down on that drive, and now she was all that was left. A stranger waiting in a town he despised. A promise he was in no shape to keep. He did not know what he would do with her. His cabin smelled of stale whiskey and blood from where he'd stitched himself up. His land felt haunted. He was in no condition to be a husband to anyone. He was barely a man, but he had made a bargain. And out here, a man's word was the last thing he had left to lose. Some 100 miles east, Clara Mayhew sat on a hard wooden bench at the dusty train station in Redemption, a town that felt like it had been forgotten by God. She kept her hands folded neatly in the lap of her gray traveling dress, her back ramrod straight, her expression a carefully constructed mask of serene patience. Inside, her stomach was a knot of cold dread. She had been waiting for 3 days, each morning. She left the boarding house, her small trunk in hand, and sat on this bench until the sun began to bleed across the horizon. Each evening, she returned, paid the disapproving landlady for another night, and lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of a world she did not belong in. She was beautiful, in a way that made men look twice and women narrow their eyes. Her hair was the color of dark honey, pinned up in a severe bun that could not quite tame the rebellious curls around her face. She had a full figure, the kind of womanly curves that her mother had always called a liability, and eyes the color of a stormy sea. But the beauty was a curse. It was her beauty that had drawn the eye of the judge back in Ohio. It was her beauty that had made him believe he had a right to her. And it was her beauty that had made everyone else, her family, the town, the law, believe his story over hers. They had not called it an assault. They had called it a scandal. They had whispered that she had encouraged him, that a girl with a shape like hers was just asking for trouble. Her family had not wanted to protect her. They had wanted to erase the shame she had brought upon them. So they had answered an advertisement, paid her passage, and sent her west into the arms of a stranger, a cowboy named Levi Garrett. It was a banishment disguised as an opportunity. Here, in this raw, unforgiving land, her past was supposed to die, but it lived inside her, a living thing with claws and teeth. Every time a man's shadow fell over her, she flinched. Every loud voice made her heart hammer against her ribs. She had built a wall of grace and quiet obedience around herself, a fortress of politeness. But behind the wall, she was fractured, a shattered piece of porcelain glued back together with fear. She did not want this Levi Garrett to come for her. but she had nowhere else to go. She had $20 left in her reticule and a past that would follow her no matter how far she ran. On the afternoon of the third day, when the dust storm that had been tormenting Levi finally reached the town, he rode in. He did not look like the man in the fuzzy photograph she carried, a man with a steady gaze and a hint of a smile. The man who dismounted in front of the station was gaunt and hollow-eyed, his face a mask of trail dust and dried blood. His shirt was torn at the shoulder and stained dark. He moved with a stiff, painful deliberation, and when he looked at her, his eyes were as bleak and empty as the prairie sky.
"Clara Mayhew."
His voice was a low rasp, rough as gravel. She stood, smoothing the front of her dress with hands that did not tremble, though it took all her will to keep them steady. "Mr. Garrett." He just nodded, his gaze sweeping over her once, taking in the neat dress, the tidy hair, the rigid posture. There was no warmth in his look, no welcome, only a weary resignation. He saw her trunk. "That all you got?"
"Yes."
"All right then." He did not apologize for being late. He did not explain the blood or the limp. He simply gestured toward his horse and the pack mule tied behind it. "It's a 2-day ride. We'll have to make camp." Clara looked at the exhausted animals, at the wildness in the man's eyes, and felt a fresh wave of despair. This was her new life, this broken man, this desolate land. She had traded one prison for another, but she did not let it show on her face. She simply picked up her trunk and walked toward him, her head held high. She did not want to go with him, but the alternative was to be stranded here, to starve, to face the same kind of men she had fled from. He was the devil she did not know, and that seemed marginally better than the one she did. Their journey was a long, punishing silence. Levi rode ahead, his shoulders slumped, his focus entirely on the trail. Clara followed on the mule, the animal's swaying gait jarring her bones. The wind howled around them, and the landscape grew more rugged, more desolate. They passed skeletal trees and sun-bleached rocks that looked like ancient bones sticking out of the earth. The silence between them was not peaceful. It was a heavy, suffocating thing, filled with everything they were not saying. She did not ask about his wound. He did not ask about her past. They were two strangers bound by a contract, moving through a world that did not care if they lived or died. As dusk began to settle on the first day, the sky, which had been a menacing gray, tore open. Rain came down not in drops but in solid, wind-driven sheets. Thunder cracked overhead, a sound so violent it seemed to shake the very ground beneath them. "There's a line shack," Levi yelled over the roar of the storm, pointing toward a dark shape huddled against a low butte. "We can shelter there." He urged the horses forward, and Clara held on tight as the mule scrambled over the rocky terrain. The shack was little more than a crude box of rotting timber, abandoned and forgotten. The door hung on one hinge, and the wind shrieked through the gaps in the walls, but it was shelter. Levi pulled the animals under a small overhang and then pushed his way into the single dark room. It smelled of damp earth, rot, and old sorrows. He struck a match, the sudden flare of light illuminating his grim face. He lit a lantern he'd pulled from his saddlebag, and its weak, yellow glow pushed back the shadows. The shack was empty save for a few mice droppings and a pile of old burlap sacks in one corner. "It ain't much," he said, his voice flat, "but it's dry." Clara stood just inside the doorway, water dripping from the hem of her dress, her body shivering with a cold that had little to do with the rain. Levi glanced at her, then seemed to notice for the first time the flimsy, button-up shoes on her feet, now caked with mud and soaked through. "Take those off," he commanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Your feet'll be raw." She hesitated. The thought of being barefoot in front of this man, of that small vulnerability, sent a tremor of fear through her. But her feet were already aching, the leather rubbing her skin raw. She sat on the dusty floor, her back against the wall, and slowly unlaced her shoes. Her stockings were wet and torn, and her feet were pale and blistered. Levi moved without a word. He took a small tin of salve from his saddlebag and a strip of clean cloth. He knelt in front of her. The sudden proximity made her breath catch in her throat. She wanted to pull her feet away, to curl into herself and disappear. He reached out, and she flinched. A sharp, involuntary jerk. His hand stopped in midair. He did not speak. He just looked at her, his dark eyes holding hers in the flickering light. In that moment, he saw it. He saw the terror she hid so well behind her polite facade. He saw the fracture lines, the carefully repaired damage. He saw a brokenness that mirrored his own, and his expression, for the first time, softened with something other than exhaustion. It was not pity, it was recognition. He moved his hand forward again, slowly this time, giving her time to pull away. His touch, when it came, was shockingly gentle. His fingers were calloused and rough from years of leather reins and hard labor. But he handled her foot as if it were a fragile, wounded bird. He carefully cleaned the mud away and then, with a surprising tenderness, began to rub the salve into the blisters on her heels and toes. Clara did not move. She did not breathe. A man's hands on her were a source of terror, a prelude to pain and violation. But this was different. This was not a touch of possession or demand. It was a touch of care, a simple, practical act of kindness in the middle of a storm. A tear she had not known she was holding back slipped from her eye and traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. She turned her head away, hoping he would not see. He said nothing. He simply finished with one foot and then the other, wrapping them carefully in the clean cloths. When he was done, he sat back on his heels. The space between them once again filled with a heavy silence. But it was a different kind of silence now. The tension had eased, replaced by a fragile, unspoken understanding. They were both damaged goods. They were both hiding their wounds. And in this small, forgotten shack, surrounded by the fury of the storm, they had caught a glimpse of each other's scars. They reached his ranch the following afternoon. It was not much more than the line shack they had sheltered in. A small, rough-hewn cabin sat in a clearing, looking stark and lonely against the vast backdrop of the mountains. A half-built corral stood beside a sturdy-looking barn. The place felt neglected, the land around it untamed. It was clear this was the home of a man who had given up. The inside of the cabin was worse. It smelled of whiskey, old sweat, and the metallic tang of dried blood. A dirty bandage lay on the floor next to a cot, and an empty bottle stood on the small table. It was the smell of pain and despair. Levi saw her take it in, her composure unwavering. He felt a fresh stab of shame. "It's not fit," he mumbled, turning away from her. "The barn's clean. There's a loft. You can stay there for now, until I can clean up." He carried her trunk to the barn without another word. The barn was large and smelled sweetly of hay and leather. A sturdy ladder led up to a spacious loft. It was empty, but it was clean and dry. It felt safer than the cabin. It felt separate. "You don't have to," he said, his back still to her as he stood at the bottom of the ladder. "You don't have to do anything you don't want to do. Clara, I won't make you." It was the first time he had said her name. The words hung in the air between them. An unexpected offering, agency, a choice. It was something she had not been given in a very long time. She looked at the hard line of his shoulders, the way he held himself as if expecting a blow. He was not the monster she had feared. He was just a man drowning in his own pain. "The barn will be fine," she said softly. "Thank you, Mr. Garrett." He just grunted in response and left her there, retreating back to the suffocating confines of his cabin and his ghosts. That night, Clara could not sleep. She lay in the hay, wrapped in a blanket from her trunk, listening to the sounds of the night. The wind whispered through the eaves of the barn, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to the moon. And from the cabin, she heard another sound, a low cry, choked off, then another. She rose from the hay and crept to the edge of the loft, peering through a wide gap in the timbers that overlooked the cabin's single, uncurtained window. By the light of the moon, she could see him on his cot. He was not sleeping peacefully. He was thrashing, tangled in his thin blanket. His hands were clenched into fists, and one arm was thrown across his eyes. He cried out again, a name this time, raw with anguish. Then he curled onto his side, his hand clutching the wound there, his body tight with a pain that was clearly more than physical. Clara watched him, her heart aching with a strange, unfamiliar empathy. She saw not a fearsome stranger, but a man as haunted as she was. He was trapped in his own nightmare, just as she was so often trapped in hers. She knew the feeling of waking up screaming, of a past that would not stay buried. She saw his torment, and in it, she recognized her own. She sank back into the shadows of the loft, pulling her knees to her chest. She thought of the judge's hands on her, of the shame that felt like a permanent stain on her soul, of the survival mantra she had whispered to herself in the dark for months, a promise to endure, a vow to not let the pain break her. Looking out at the silhouette of the man in the cabin, she whispered the words into the hay-scented darkness. They were not meant for him. They were a prayer she had learned to say for herself, a quiet declaration of resilience in a world that had tried to crush her.
I won't ask you to stop,
she breathed, her voice barely audible.
even if it hurts.
Dawn broke thin and gray over the mountains, casting a pale, hesitant light into the barn loft. Clara was already awake. Sleep offered no rest, only a different kind of exhaustion. She had listened for hours to the sound of Levi's troubled sleep, the ghosts in his cabin calling out to the ghosts in her own mind. When the first birds began to sing, she rose from the hay, her body stiff and cold. She would not be idle. Idleness was dangerous. It left too much room for the memories to creep in. She found a broom leaning against the barn wall and made her way to the cabin. Pushing the door open, she was hit again by the stale, sour smell of a place where a man had given up. It was the smell of defeat. She opened the single window, letting the crisp morning air flood the small room. Her hands trembled as she picked up the empty whiskey bottle, the weight of it in her hand suddenly too heavy, too familiar. For a moment, she was not in a dusty cabin in the West, but in a grand study back in Ohio, the air thick with the scent of expensive brandy and cigar smoke. She could feel the plush carpet under her knees, the cold shock of a spilled drink on her dress. She squeezed her eyes shut, forcing the image away, and placed the bottle carefully outside the door. She worked with a quiet, frantic energy. She swept the floor, the rhythmic scrape of the broom a comfort against the chaos in her head. She stripped the soiled blanket from the cot and took it outside to beat the dust and sorrow out of it. She found a bucket and a rag and began to scrub the floorboards, her knuckles raw against the rough wood. With every methodical stroke, she fought back the rising panic, the phantom sensation of a heavy hand on her shoulder. She would make this place clean. She would impose order on this small corner of the world because she could not impose it on the wilderness of her own memory. Levi emerged from the barn as she was coaxing a small flame to life in the stone fireplace. He had been tending to the horses. He stopped in the doorway, watching her. He was a shadow blocking the morning sun, his expression unreadable. He looked at the swept floor, the neatly folded blanket, the nascent fire. He looked at her, and she felt his gaze like a physical touch, her entire body tensing. She expected him to be angry, to see her actions as an intrusion, a judgment on his life. "There's coffee in the saddlebag," was all he said, his voice a low rumble. Then he turned and walked away, toward the half-built corral, leaving her alone with the crackling fire and the scent of wood smoke. He avoided her for the rest of the morning, his movements creating a wide, invisible circle around the cabin, around her. He worked on the fence, his back a rigid wall of muscle and unspoken pain. Clara watched him from the window, her hands still trembling slightly. They were two planets in a silent, lonely orbit, held together by a contract but kept apart by forces neither of them understood. Later that week, visitors arrived. A buckboard rattled up the path, carrying a stout, grim-faced man and his equally grim-faced wife. They introduced themselves as Jed and Martha Coulson, their nearest neighbors, though their homestead was a good 5 miles away. Martha's eyes, small and sharp as a bird's, took in everything at a glance: the clean cabin, Clara's mended dress, the dark circles under her eyes. "We heard you'd arrived," Martha said, her voice carrying a tone of pious concern that did not quite mask her intrusive curiosity. She handed Clara a small sack of flour. "A welcome. It's a hard life out here for a woman." Clara thanked her, her own voice a polite murmur. She offered them water, which they accepted, their gazes constantly shifting from her to Levi, who stood awkwardly by the porch, his hat in his hands. The conversation was stilted, full of talk about the lack of rain and the price of cattle, but underneath the mundane words, Clara felt the current of judgment. They were sizing her up, trying to solve the puzzle of her presence. A woman like her, young and presentable, did not end up in a place like this, with a man like Levi Garrett, unless something was wrong. As they were leaving, Martha pulled Clara aside, her hand a dry, bony claw on Clara's arm. "You're a brave girl," she whispered, her eyes boring into Clara's. To take on a man with his reputation, after what happened on that cattle drive, and everything before, you must have been in a desperate way, child. The words were a slap in the face, a reputation, desperate. The woman's insinuation was clear. She believed Clara was damaged goods, a woman who had run out of options. The heat of shame crept up Clara's neck, a familiar, burning tide. She did not know what reputation the woman spoke of, but she knew the sting of being judged, of being summed up and found wanting. She pulled her arm away, her mask of grace firmly in place. "And Mr. Garrett has been a gentleman," she said, her voice cold and even. "Thank you for the flour, Mrs. Coulson." She watched the buckboard disappear in a cloud of dust, the older woman's words echoing in her mind. She looked over at Levi, who was already walking back to the corral, his shoulders hunched as if carrying a great weight. What had happened before the cattle drive? What was this reputation he carried? The mystery of him deepened. Another layer of shadow and silence. A few evenings later, she saw the truth of that reputation etched into his skin. The day had been long and hot, and a thick layer of dust covered everything. Levi was at the water pump near the barn, stripped to the waist, washing away the grime of his labor. The setting sun cast long shadows, and the light caught the slick sheen of water on his skin, and on his scars. Clara had stopped on her way back from collecting eggs, hidden by the corner of the barn. She could not look away. She had seen the fresh wound in his side, but she had not been prepared for the map of old violence that covered his torso. There was the puckered, angry star of a bullet wound high on his shoulder, a long, silver line of a knife scar slashed diagonally across his ribs. There were other, smaller marks, nicks and cuts from a life of hard fighting, but it was the scars on his back that made her breath catch. As he turned to grab a towel, she saw them clearly, faint, parallel lines, lacy white against his tanned skin. They were old, but they were unmistakable. Whip marks, a latticework of punishment that spoke of a past far darker than a simple range dispute. Her mind recoiled from the implications. Who was this man she had bound herself to? He was not just a grieving cowboy. He was a man who had been shot, cut, and whipped. He was a man who fought nightmares in his sleep and was judged by his neighbors when he was awake. A flicker of curiosity, sharp and insistent, pierced through her fear. It was not a romantic curiosity. It was the stark, raw interest of one survivor recognizing another. She wanted to know the story of those marks, just as she was terrified to ever tell the story of her own. That night, they ate dinner in near silence, as they always did. Clara had made a stew from a rabbit Levi had shot, and the cabin was filled with the savory aroma of cooking meat and herbs. It was the closest they had come to domesticity, and the illusion was so fragile that a single word could shatter it. It was Levi who spoke first. He put down his spoon, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. "Clara," he said, not looking at her, "why did you come out here?" The question was a stone dropped into a still pond. The ripples of it spread through her, cold and fast. He was asking for a piece of her story, a piece she kept locked away in the darkest part of her heart. She could not give it to him. She could not give it to anyone. To speak it would be to make it real again.
I wanted a better life.
She lied. The words tasted like ash in her mouth. A chance to start over. Ohio was crowded. It was a weak lie, thin and transparent, and she knew he could see right through it. She braced herself for more questions, for him to press, to demand the truth he had paid for. But he did not. He finally raised his eyes to hers, and in their depths, she saw that same flicker of recognition she had seen in the line shack. He saw the lie, but he also saw the terror behind it. He saw the cornered look in her eyes, the desperate plea for him to let it be. He saw her shame, and he did not challenge it. "Right," he said, picking up his spoon again. "Crowded." He did not ask anything more. By saying nothing, he gave her a gift greater than any words of comfort. He gave her sanctuary for her secrets. He let her keep the walls around her intact. The next afternoon, she watched him shoeing one of the horses. The gelding was skittish, favoring one leg. Levi spoke to it in a low, calming murmur, his large hands moving over the animal's powerful body with an expert's confidence. He was strong. She could see the muscles in his back and shoulders straining as he lifted the heavy hoof. But his touch was all gentleness. He held the hoof cradled between his knees, his movements economical and precise as he fitted the hot iron. He was mending something that was broken, and he did it with a quiet, focused patience. He handled the powerful, nervous creature with the same surprising gentleness he had used on her blistered feet. Later, as the sun began to set, she saw him sitting on the edge of the porch, his face pale and drawn with pain. He had pushed himself too hard, and his wound was troubling him. He had his hand pressed to his side, his breathing shallow. Without thinking, Clara soaked a cloth in cool water from the pump and took it to him. She stopped in front of him, holding out the dripping cloth. He looked up at her, surprised. He hesitated for a moment, then took it from her, his fingers brushing hers. The touch was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt through her. He pressed the cool cloth to his side with a sigh of relief. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough. She nodded, about to retreat back into her silence, but she stayed. She sat on the step below him, not too close, but not far either. They sat there for a long time, watching the sky turn from orange to purple, the first stars beginning to appear. The silence was different this time. It was not empty or tense. It was companionable. "I lost 2 men," he said suddenly, his voice so low she almost did not hear him. He was not looking at her, but out at the dark line of the mountains. "On the drive. Boys, really. One of them wasn't even 20. We were ambushed. For the cattle, for the payroll." He paused, and she could hear the ragged edge in his breath. "There was a moment, right before it all started. I saw something, a glint of light, but I didn't trust it. Then a boy on the other side, one of the rustlers. He reached for his gun. He was just a kid, too, and I froze. I just sat there on my horse and watched him draw. I saw him aim. I watched him kill the boy beside me." He finally turned to look at her, his eyes hollow with a self-loathing so profound it was painful to witness. "I was the trail boss. They were my responsibility. And I froze." He blamed himself. That was his nightmare. That was the ghost that haunted him. Not the pain of his wound, but the agony of his failure. Clara's heart ached for him. She understood that kind of shame, the kind that replayed itself over and over in the dead of night. She had no words of comfort to offer, What could she say? It wasn't your fault. They would be empty words. A lie. So she said nothing. She just sat there beside him in the growing darkness, her silence a soft blanket. She did not judge him. She did not try to fix him. She simply listened, and in that shared, silent space, a fragile thread of trust began to form between them. That night, the dream came for her. It was always the same. The heavy oak door of the study, the smell of brandy and leather, the click of the lock, the judge's voice, a low purr of possession, his face, florid and smiling, looming over her, the weight of him, crushing the air from her lungs, the tearing of her dress, the pain, the shame, the suffocating helplessness. She fought in the dream, but her limbs were made of lead. She tried to scream, but no sound would come out. She woke up screaming. The sound was ripped from her throat, a raw animal cry of pure terror. She was sitting bolt upright in the hay, her body drenched in a cold sweat, her heart hammering against her ribs as if it wanted to break free. The barn was dark, but the dream was still there, clinging to her like a shroud. The cabin door burst open, and Levi was there, a silhouette against the moonlight, a pistol in his hand. He moved with a frightening speed, his body coiled and ready for a fight. He expected to find a snake, a wolf, an intruder. He expected a threat he could see and kill. He stormed into the barn, his eyes scanning the shadows. "Clara!" he yelled, his voice sharp with alarm. He saw her then, a crumpled shape in the hayloft, her hands covering her face, her shoulders shaking with violent sobs. The fight went out of him instantly. He lowered the pistol, his whole body seeming to sag with a different kind of tension. He climbed the ladder quickly, his movements urgent. "What is it? What happened?" he asked, his voice low and tight. She could not answer. She could only rock back and forth, trapped in the aftermath of the terror. He reached for her, his hand outstretched, his instinct to comfort, to protect. As his hand neared her shoulder, she flinched away violently, the words tumbling out of her mouth, the old, desperate mantra from the dream. "Don't stop!" she gasped, her voice choked with sobs. Levi froze. His hand stopped inches from her. The air in the loft grew thick and cold. He stared at her, his face a mask of confusion and a dawning, terrible understanding. She did not see his confusion. She was still in the dream, still fighting a ghost. She grabbed the front of his shirt with a desperate strength, her knuckles white. She looked up at him, her eyes wild with a terror he was only just beginning to comprehend. "Even if it hurts," she whispered, the words a ragged plea. And in that moment, he understood. He understood everything. The flinch in the line shack, the lie about her past, the haunted look in her eyes. She was not speaking to him. The words were not an invitation. They were a memory, a horrible, echoing command from a past she could not escape. He was not seeing Clara, the quiet woman who cleaned his cabin. He was seeing a victim, reliving the moment of her deepest trauma. A wave of cold fury washed over him, so intense it made him dizzy. He wanted to find the man who had done this to her and tear him apart with his bare hands. But that fury was useless here. The enemy was a ghost in her mind. He did not touch her. He did not pull her into his arms or try to soothe her with empty words. He did the only thing he could. He slowly, carefully, sank to his knees in the hay in front of her. He let her keep her grip on his shirt. And then he took her other hand, the one that was not clenched in his shirt, and simply held it. His grip was firm, steady, a silent anchor in the storm of her terror. He did not speak. He just held her hand, his presence a solid, unmoving promise in the dark. He stayed with her like that for hours. He stayed as her sobs slowly subsided into shuddering breaths. He stayed as the terror finally receded from her eyes, replaced by a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. He stayed until the first pale light of dawn began to filter through the cracks in the barn walls, chasing the last of the shadows away. He just stayed, holding her hand, until morning came. The summer arrived like a fever, relentless and suffocating. The sun beat down on the hard-packed earth, baking it into a cracked, dusty plate. The air grew thick and heavy, shimmering with a heat that made the distant mountains wobble and swim. For Levi, the heat was a penance. He worked from the moment the sun's first rays bled over the horizon until long after it had sunk in a blaze of orange and purple. He threw himself into the labor, mending the fences that had sagged with neglect. Clearing stones from a field he had no real hope of plowing. Reinforcing the corral post by post, he courted exhaustion, welcoming the ache in his muscles because it was a clean pain, a simple pain, one that could for a moment drown out the complex, festering wound in his soul. But no matter how hard he worked, his eyes always found her. He would be splitting logs, the axe falling in a steady, punishing rhythm, and he would see her out in the small garden she had tilled near the cabin. She would be on her knees, her face shaded by a bonnet, patiently coaxing green shoots from the unforgiving soil. He would be wrestling with a stubborn fence post, his hands raw and bleeding, and he would catch a glimpse of her walking back from the chicken coop, her movements graceful and deliberate, the basket of eggs held carefully in her arms. She moved through his world with a quiet determination that both mystified and humbled him. Since the night of her nightmare, a new, unspoken language had developed between them. They still rarely spoke, but the silence was no longer a void. It was charged with a heavy awareness. He saw the tremor that sometimes returned to her hands, the way she would stare at a fixed point in the distance, her eyes seeing something far away and terrible, and he knew she saw him, too. She saw the way he would sometimes stop, his hand drifting to his side, his face tight with a pain that was more than memory. They were two wounded animals circling each other, the space between them filled with a fragile, dangerous understanding. One evening, the oppressive heat finally broke. A breeze ghosted down from the mountains, carrying the clean scent of pine and cool earth. Levi was behind the barn, working by the light of a fading sky, trying to mend a piece of tack that had broken. His shirt was off, pasted to a nearby fence post, and the cool air was a welcome relief on his sweat-slicked skin. He was so lost in his work, in the familiar pull of leather and thread, that he did not hear her approach. "You'll work yourself into the grave, Mr. Garrett." Her voice was soft, startling him. He looked up. Clara stood a few feet away, her form a dark silhouette against the last of the twilight. In one hand, she held a small bottle of whiskey and a roll of clean bandages. In the other, a tin cup. He grunted, turning back to his work. "It needs doing." "Your side is bleeding again," she said, her tone quiet but firm. "You tore the stitches." He could feel the familiar, sticky warmth seeping into the waistband of his trousers. He had been ignoring it, as he ignored most things that hurt. She stepped closer, into the small circle of his space. He could smell the faint scent of soap and the herbs from her garden clinging to her clothes. "Let me see," she said. It was not a request. He hesitated, a knot of resistance tightening in his gut. To let her tend to him was an act of intimacy his scarred soul shied away from. But there was a weariness in him that went bone deep, and he was tired of fighting. He was tired of being alone with his pain. He slowly turned, exposing his side to her. The wound was angry and inflamed, a ragged tear weeping blood. She knelt in the dirt in front of him, her movements fluid and unhurried. She poured a little of the whiskey onto a strip of bandage and began to clean the wound. Her touch was as gentle as it had been in the line shack, but this time it was different. It was purposeful. He grit his teeth as the alcohol stung, the sharp, clean fire a shock to his system. As she worked, her head bent over her task. A lock of honey-colored hair escaped her bun and fell across her cheek. He had the sudden, insane urge to reach out and tuck it behind her ear. He clenched his fists instead. When she had cleaned and bandaged the wound, she did not move away. Her fingers rested for a moment on the healthy skin just above the bandage, Then, slowly, deliberately, she traced the long, silver line of the knife scar that ran across his ribs. Her touch was light as a feather, but it sent a tremor through his entire body. He stood rigid, his breath caught in his chest. Her fingers continued their exploration, moving upward, tracing the puckered star of the old bullet wound on his shoulder. It was a cartographer's touch, mapping the landscape of his pain. Then her hand moved to his back. She found one of the old, faint lines of the whip marks. Her fingers followed the scar. A path of raised, dead skin. Levi flinched, a sharp, involuntary jerk, as if the lash had just fallen. The shame of those marks ran deeper than any other. They were a brand of humiliation, a story he had never told. He started to pull away, to turn from her, to hide the evidence of his past. "Clara," he began, his voice a rough, strangled sound. But she moved with him, her other hand coming up to rest on his shoulder, stopping him. She leaned in close, her breath warm against his skin. And then, she pressed her lips to the scar. It was not a passionate kiss. It was a tender, solemn act of reverence, an absolution. It was an acknowledgement of a pain so old he had forgotten what it felt like to not carry it. The sensation shattered something inside him. He tried again to pull away, a wave of panic and unworthiness rising in his throat. This was too much. This tenderness was a language he no longer spoke, a gift he did not deserve. "Don't stop," she whispered against his back, her voice a fragile plea. Her hand tightened on his shoulder. He froze, the words a cold shock, pulling him back to the darkness of the loft, to the terror in her eyes. But the tone was different now. It was not the ragged gasp of a nightmare. It was a conscious, deliberate whisper, a choice. She was taking the words that had been used to break her and was remaking them. She was turning a weapon into a key. He slowly turned to face her. Her eyes were wide and dark in the twilight, shimmering with unshed tears. But there was no fear in them. There was only a profound, bottomless well of need. A need so raw and so deep it mirrored his own.
Even if it hurts,
She whispered again, her gaze locked on his. He did not know who moved first. It was a collision, a mutual, desperate closing of the space between them. His mouth found hers, and the kiss was not gentle. It was raw. It was hungry. It was the frantic, desperate kiss of two people who had been starving for a touch that was not violent, for a connection that was not a transaction. It was the taste of whiskey and salt and a loneliness so vast it had almost consumed them both. His hands tangled in her hair, pulling the pins free, letting the dark honey cascade over his fingers. Her arms wrapped around his neck, pulling him down, her body pressing against his. She broke the kiss, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Without a word, she took his hand and led him into the deep shadows of the barn, into the sweet-smelling hay. She pulled him down with her. It was not a soft bed. The hay was rough and prickly against his bare back, the ground beneath it hard and unyielding. It was real. It was not a fantasy or a dream. It was as rough and as real as they were. Their joining was as desperate and as raw as their kiss. A frantic, fumbling search for something solid in a world that had offered them none. It was a silent, violent prayer, a confirmation of life in the face of so much death. Afterward, they lay in the darkness, not touching, the sound of their own breathing loud in the sudden silence. The world rushed back in, and with it came the guilt. It flooded Levi, a cold, sickening tide. He was a monster. He had taken advantage of her. He had seen her brokenness, her terror, and he had used it. He had taken the last thing she had left. "I'm sorry," he whispered into the darkness, the words tasting like poison. "Clara, I shouldn't have—" She did not answer for a long moment. Then, she reached out in the dark and found his hand. She guided it to her chest, pressing his palm flat against her sternum, over her wildly beating heart. "I needed you to want me," she said, her voice thick with a vulnerability that stole his breath.
I needed to feel wanted by a good man.
The simple, heartbreaking confession undid him. It had not been an act of submission. It had been an act of reclamation, an act of defiance. She was not a victim in this. She had been the one in control, the one who had led him, the one who had chosen. He closed his eyes, overwhelmed by a wave of emotion so powerful he could not put a name to it. He just held his hand over her heart, feeling the steady, frantic rhythm of her life beneath his palm. In the weeks that followed, the fragile sanctuary they had built began to crumble. Levi had to ride into Redemption for supplies, and, for the first time, Clara went with him. A change had settled between them since that night. The silence was easier now, the orbits of their lives overlapping in small, significant ways. He found himself looking for her smile, a rare, fleeting thing that lit up her whole face. She found herself listening for the sound of his horse at the end of the day, a quiet reassurance that he was coming home. The town, however, had not changed. It was still a place of narrow eyes and narrow minds. As Clara waited for Levi outside the general store, a man stumbled out of the saloon across the street. He was heavy-set, with a florid face and small, piggish eyes. He stopped and stared at her, a slow, greasy smile spreading across his face. "Well, I'll be," he slurred, pointing a thick finger at her. "I know you. You're the one from back in Ohio. The judge's girl." Clara froze, the blood draining from her face. It was Silas Croft, the owner of the saloon. He had done business with the judge. She remembered him from a brief, unpleasant encounter a lifetime ago. His voice was loud, carrying across the dusty street. A few people stopped to listen. "Heard you ran out on him, caused a whole mess of trouble for a good man. Looks like you landed on your feet, though found another man to take you in." The words were stones, and they hit her with physical force. She turned her back on him, her hands clenched at her sides, and prayed for Levi to come out of the store. The story spread through the town like a prairie fire. The saloon owner's words gave shape and voice to the whispers that had been circulating for months. The vague judgment of Martha Coulson now had a specific, sordid narrative to latch onto. The judge's girl, a troublemaker, a fallen woman. The final, brutal blow came a few days later. Clara was in the general store alone, buying thread. A man came in, his boots heavy on the floorboards. He was a rancher named Amos Holt, a bitter man whose family had lost a parcel of land to Levi's father in a legal dispute years ago. He had always hated the Garretts, and now he had a new weapon. He cornered her by the bolt goods, his body blocking her escape. He smelled of sweat and stale tobacco. "So, you're the whore Garrett brought home," he said, his voice a low, vicious snarl. "Heard all about you. A man like Judge Parker doesn't just throw a girl out for no reason. You must not have any morals at all. Coming out here, pretending to be decent." Every word was a nail in the coffin of her fragile recovery. Whore, no morals, the old accusations, the old shame. It was all here, in this dusty store, in this man's hateful eyes. She felt the floor drop out from under her. She could not breathe. She pushed past him, dropping her basket, and ran. She ran out of the store, out of the town, not stopping until her lungs burned and her legs gave out. She collapsed in the dirt behind the barn, the one place she had felt safe, the one place where she had felt wanted, but it was tainted now. The world had found her. Her past had found her. She curled into a ball, her body racked with sobs of grief and despair. It was over. She had only brought her shame here, to this man's doorstep. She would ruin him, just as Martha Coulson had hinted. She was a plague. Levi found her there, a small, broken heap in the dust. He knelt beside her, his face a grim mask of concern. "Clara, what is it? What happened?" She looked up at him, her face streaked with tears and dirt. "They know," she choked out. "Everyone knows.
I'm sorry, Levi. I'm so sorry. You have to send me away. Forget about me. Please, I'll only bring you trouble.
She begged him, her voice raw with self-loathing. She was poison, and she was begging him to save himself from her. He listened, his expression hardening with a cold, protective fury. He looked at her, truly looked at her, at the woman who had kissed his scars, the woman who had brought his deadened heart back to life. He saw her trying to erase herself, to sacrifice herself for his sake. Instead of agreeing, instead of turning away, he reached out and pulled her into his arms. He held her tight against his chest, his hand stroking her hair. He held her as she sobbed, absorbing her pain, her shame. When her crying had subsided to shuddering breaths, he pulled back just enough to look her in the eyes. "You're the only thing that's made me want to live again," he said, his voice thick with an emotion so fierce it was almost violent. "Before you came, I was just waiting to die. Do you understand me? I don't care what they say. I don't care what you did or what was done to you. You are here, with me, and that's all that matters." The words were a lifeline. She stared at him, unable to comprehend the fierce loyalty in his eyes. He was not casting her out. He was holding on tighter. That night, they came together again in the hayloft. But it was different this time. The first time had been a desperate, hungry collision in the dark. This time, it was a conscious choice in the moonlight that streamed through the cracks in the walls. It was slow. It was tender. It was filled with a fire that burned away the shame and the fear, at least for a little while. His hands moved over her with a reverence that made her want to weep. He kissed the tears from her cheeks, his touch a gentle promise. He was not just taking her body, he was seeing her soul. Later, as they lay tangled together in the hay, he whispered into the darkness, "I'll fight for you. Clara, I swear it. I won't let them hurt you." She heard the words, and a part of her, a small, hopeful part she thought had died long ago, wanted desperately to believe him. But she had been taught by a cruel world that she was not worth fighting for. She did not believe anyone ever had. She just held on to him, a silent, fragile hope taking root in the barren landscape of her heart. The tenuous peace they had built was shattered by a piece of paper. It arrived with the circuit rider, a thin, stooped man who brought news and sermons to the scattered homesteads. The letter was not for Levi, but for the sheriff in redemption. The rider, however, had been paid extra to deliver a message first. He recited it from memory, his voice a droning monotone that belied the venom in the words. Judge Silas Parker of Ohio was on his way. He was coming to reclaim his runaway ward, Clara Mayhew, who had fled his benevolent care after stealing a significant sum of money. He held a warrant for her arrest. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Clara stood on the porch, her hands gripping the railing so tightly her knuckles were white mountains on a pale landscape. It was not just shame that had followed her west. It was the law, twisted and weaponized against her. After the attack, when she had threatened to expose him, the judge had been coldly efficient. He had used his power, his influence, to paint her as a hysterical, ungrateful thief. He had promised her that if she ever spoke a word of the truth, he would see her jailed and ruined. Her family, terrified of the scandal, had bundled her onto the train west, not just to hide their shame, but to help her escape the bars of a prison cell. Levi's reaction was a slow, coiling fury. The muscles in his jaw knotted, and his eyes, when he looked at her, were chips of black ice. His protective instinct, always simmering just beneath the surface, now boiled over. "We ride out," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Tonight, we can be in the territories in a week. He'll never find you." He was already moving, his mind calculating routes, supplies, escape. He would burn the whole world down to keep her safe. But Clara did not move. She looked out at the land, at the horizon that had once seemed like a prison wall but now felt like the edge of her own small, hard-won world. She thought of the garden, of the warmth of the cabin, of the quiet strength in the man who stood before her, ready to abandon everything for her. And she was filled with a strength she did not know she possessed.
"No," she said, her voice quiet but unshakable. "No more running. I have been hiding my whole life. Levi, hiding from what he did, hiding from what people would say. I am tired of being afraid." She turned to face him, and for the first time, there was no trace of the victim in her eyes. There was only the steady, resolute fire of a survivor. "I will face him. I will not let him call me a thief. I want justice." The town of redemption became a chessboard of whispers and alliances. The story of the coming judge and his warrant split the small community down the middle. Amos Holt and his cronies saw it as a righteous comeuppance for the Garretts. Proof that the woman Levi had taken in was nothing but a common criminal. The saloon owner, Silas Croft, preened with self-importance, embellishing his story with every telling. But others were not so sure. Martha Coulson, for all her sharp-tongued judgment, had seen the haunted look in Clara's eyes. The general store owner, a quiet man named Elias, had seen the viciousness in Amos Holt's face when he had cornered her. They had seen Levi Garrett, a man who had been slowly drinking himself to death, begin to live again. They started to wonder what kind of woman could inspire such a change. The sheriff, a man named Bo Calloway, was caught in the middle. He was a decent man, bound by the letter of the law. He rode out to the ranch, his face grim. He did not dismount, but spoke to Levi from his saddle. "Levi, I'm telling you, as a courtesy, I have a warrant coming. When that judge gets here, I will have to serve it. If you interfere, if you try to stop me, I'll have to arrest you for obstruction. My hands are tied." "The warrant is based on a lie," Levi said, his voice dangerously calm. "That may be," Calloway sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "But it's a lie on a piece of paper signed by a judge. And out here, that's what matters. Just stay out of it. Levi, for your own good." He rode off, leaving the warning hanging in the thick, hot air. Levi watched him go, then turned and walked toward the barn. He returned with a pistol, its steel barrel gleaming dully in the sunlight, and a box of cartridges. He found Clara by the chicken coop, her hands clenched in her apron. He held the gun out to her. "But first, you want to face him," he said, his voice flat. "Then you need to be ready to face him." She stared at the gun, a cold knot of fear tightening in her stomach. It was a thing of violence, a tool for death. But she thought of the judge's hands, of the cold click of the lock on his study door. That had been violence, too. This was different. This was power. She took the pistol, its weight a heavy, solid reality in her hand. He taught her behind the barn, in the long shadows of the late afternoon. He stood behind her, his body close but not touching, his voice a low murmur in her ear. Her hands shook at first, the muzzle of the gun wavering. The first shot she fired went wide, kicking up a puff of dust 10 feet from the tin can he had set on a fence post. The loud report of the gun made her flinch, the memory of other loud, angry sounds echoing in her mind. "You're thinking about him," Levi said, his voice calm and steady. "You're letting the rage aim for you. This isn't about him. This is about you. This is about control." He gently adjusted her stance, his hands on her shoulders. "Breathe. Feel the weight of it in your hand. Know that you are the one who decides. Now breathe out slow, and as you do, you squeeze. Don't pull." They spent hours there. She learned to load the weapon, to feel the solid click of the cylinder. She learned to aim, to line up the sights until the can on the fence post was all that existed in the world. And she learned to breathe. She breathed out the fear, the shame, the rage. And as her breath steadied, so did her hands. The shots grew closer, until finally, with a satisfying clang, the tin can flew off the post. She lowered the gun, the smell of gunpowder sharp in her nostrils. A small, fierce smile touching her lips. She had found a center, a point of stillness in the storm of her past. She would not be helpless again. A week later, Judge Silas Parker arrived. He did not ride in on a dusty horse, but in a polished black carriage drawn by two high-stepping bays, a luxury so out of place in Redemption it looked like a mirage. The judge himself was a large man, impeccably dressed in a dark suit, his silver hair neatly combed, his face florid and benevolent. He moved with an aura of unshakable authority, his smile condescending, his eyes cold and assessing. He did not go to the ranch. He went directly to the sheriff's office, the warrant in his hand. He did not call Clara a runaway or a whore. He was far too clever for that. He presented himself as a concerned guardian, an old friend of her father's who had taken the troubled girl in. He spoke of her with a sad, paternal sigh. He claimed she had fallen under a bad influence, had stolen some heirlooms, not for their value. He insisted, but out of a confused, rebellious streak, and that he had come all this way only to bring her home safely, where she could be cared for. The sheriff, faced with this powerful, well-spoken man and his official-looking papers, was hesitant. The story was plausible, and the man's authority was palpable. The news of his arrival reached the ranch, and a cold dread settled over Clara. This was his true weapon, not brute force, but the power of his words, his reputation. He would paint her as a madwoman, a liar, and the world would believe him, just as they had before. That Sunday, the town gathered in the small wooden church for the weekly service. The air was thick with piety and unspoken gossip. They sang a hymn, the sound of their voices thin and reedy against the vast silence of the prairie. In the middle of the circuit rider's sermon on the prodigal son, the church doors creaked open. Clara stood in the doorway, the morning sun at her back creating a halo around her. She was not dressed in her Sunday best. She wore a simple calico work dress, her hair in a plain bun. She walked down the central aisle, her footsteps echoing on the wooden floorboards. The sermon faltered and died. Every eye in the church was on her. She walked to the front and turned to face them, her expression one of profound, heartbreaking sorrow. Levi followed a few paces behind her, stopping at the end of the first pew. He did not look at the congregation. He only looked at her, his face like stone, a mountain at her back. "I am Clara Mayhew," she began, her voice trembling but clear, carrying to every corner of the small building. "Judge Parker says I am a thief. He says he is my guardian, and he has come to take me home." She paused, taking a shaky breath. "He is not my guardian. He was my employer, and I am not a thief." Tears began to trace paths down her dusty cheeks. "The night before I left Ohio, he called me into his study. He had been drinking. He locked the door." She sobbed, a raw, ragged sound that tore at the heart of the silence. He hurt me. He took what was not his to take. And when I said I would tell, he threatened me. He said he would tell everyone I was a whore, a liar, that I had stolen from him. He said he would see me put in jail. My family, they were afraid. They sent me away to save me from a prison, and to save themselves from the shame. The church was utterly silent, save for the sound of her weeping. "I came here seeking a new life. I found a good man, a man who has shown me nothing but kindness. I am not the woman the judge says I am. I am not a thief. I am not a whore. I am a woman who was wronged by a powerful man, and I will not be silent any longer." She stood there, tears streaming down her face, her vulnerability a shield and a sword. Levi moved to stand directly behind her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder, a silent, unshakable statement of his belief. A murmur went through the congregation. A few people, uncomfortable with the raw, ugly truth, got up and left, but most of them stayed. They looked at the weeping woman and the stone-faced man behind her. They looked at each other, and for the first time, a seed of doubt about the respectable, powerful judge from back east was planted in the hard soil of redemption. The retaliation was swift and cowardly.
That night, a smell woke Levi from a light sleep. Smoke, thick and acrid. He threw open the cabin door and saw it. The barn was engulfed in flames, a roaring orange monster against the blackness of the night sky, spitting embers into the air. "The horses!" he yelled, his voice raw with alarm. He ran toward the inferno, grabbing a wet blanket from the water trough as he went. He did not hesitate. He plunged into the burning building, the heat a physical blow, the smoke instantly blinding him. He could hear the terrified whinnying of the horses. Trapped in their stalls, he fought his way through the choking smoke, his lungs burning. He found the latch to the main corral gate and threw it open, slapping the panicked animals on their rumps, driving them out into the night. As he herded the last one out, a heavy, burning timber fell from the loft, striking his arm and shoulder, sending a shower of sparks over him. He stumbled out into the cool night air, collapsing on the ground, his arm a searing agony, his lungs heaving. He had saved the horses, but the barn was a total loss. He and Clara could only stand and watch as their sanctuary, the place where they had first found each other, burned to the ground. By dawn, all that was left was a smoking, blackened ruin of charred timbers and gray ash. Clara walked into the wreckage, her feet sinking into the warm ash. She knelt down, oblivious to the soot staining her dress. She reached out and touched a scorched floorboard, the place where she had let him down into the hay. It was the place where she had reclaimed her body, her choice, her life. Tears fell from her eyes, sizzling on the hot embers. She looked up at Levi, who stood beside her, his burned arm wrapped in a makeshift bandage, his face a mask of grief and fury. She kissed the charred wood, a final, heartbreaking farewell. "This was where I became yours," she whispered, her voice thick with sorrow. He knelt beside her in the ashes, pulling her into his good arm. He held her close, the smell of smoke and loss clinging to them both. He looked at the ruin of their past, then looked into her eyes, making a promise that was stronger than any fire. "We'll rebuild," he said, his voice a raw, determined vow. "We'll rebuild it all." The fire was a wound on the land, a blackened, suppurating scar where the barn had been. In its aftermath, a different kind of pressure began to build, a slow, methodical squeezing from all sides. Clara's confession in the church had not won them a clear victory. It had simply drawn the battle lines. Judge Parker, with his money and his influence, began to work not with overt threats, but with the insidious poison of rumor and bribery. He was a patient predator, content to circle his prey, to cut them off from the herd and wait for them to weaken. Amos Holt became his willing instrument. Holt and a few other ranchers who held old grudges against the Garrett name started a campaign of quiet harassment. A fence line would be cut in the dead of night, scattering the few dozen head of cattle Levi had managed to hold on to. When Levi went to the general store, the owner Elias would shake his head sadly and explain that he could no longer extend him credit. The blacksmith found a sudden backlog of work and claimed he could not get to Levi's horses for a week. They were being isolated, starved out, the lifeblood of their small ranch choked off by 100 small, unseen hands. The prejudice in town was a palpable thing, a thick, suffocating dust that settled on them whenever they rode in. People would fall silent, turning away, their faces closed and judgmental. Levi's frustration festered, turning into a grim, silent rage. He worked with a frantic intensity, trying to single-handedly hold back the tide that was threatening to drown them. His burned arm was a constant, throbbing agony, but he ignored it, his face a tight mask of pain and determination. Every setback, every whispered insult, etched another hard line into his face. He grew gaunt and haunted, the ghosts of his past now joined by the very real specters of failure and ruin. But as Levi seemed to hollow out, Clara grew stronger, the woman who had arrived in redemption, a creature of quiet fear and rigid composure, was being burned away, leaving behind someone forged in the fire of this new adversity. She worked beside him, her soft hands growing calloused and capable, She learned to ride not as a passenger, but as a rancher, her seat firm, her eyes scanning the horizon for stray cattle. She learned the smell of an infected wound, tending to his burn with a practical gentleness that was both a comfort and a quiet rebuke to his self-destructive pride. She kept the cabin, the small, solitary island in their sea of troubles, a place of warmth and order. She kept the fire going, both in the hearth and in the heart of the man who was beginning to lose hope. She was no longer just surviving her past. She was fighting for a future. And in that fight, she found a strength she never knew she possessed. One night, after a day so long and brutal it felt like a year, they sat at the small cabin table. A single lamp cast a warm, flickering glow, holding the vast, lonely darkness at bay. Levi was staring into his empty plate, his shoulders slumped with a weariness that went deeper than his muscles. The last of their flour was gone, and their prospects were as barren as the scorched earth where the barn had stood. Clara watched him, her heart aching with his unspoken despair. She reached across the table and placed her hand over his. He looked up, his eyes bleak. "Levi," she began, her voice a near whisper, so quiet he had to lean in to hear. "There is something else." He saw the fear in her eyes, a flicker of the old terror he had not seen in weeks, and his own exhaustion was instantly forgotten. "What is it? Is it the judge?" She shook her head, pulling her hand back, wrapping her arms around her own waist in a protective gesture. "I am with child." The words fell into the silence of the cabin, small and immense at the same time. Levi stared at her, his mind struggling to comprehend. A child, a baby, here, now, in the middle of this ruin. He saw the fear on her face, the deep-seated worry that this news would be the final straw, the one burden that would finally break his back. She thought he would see it as a curse, another mouth to feed, another vulnerability in a world full of predators. He did not speak. He simply looked at her, at the woman who had faced down her own demons and the judgment of an entire town, the woman who worked beside him from sunup to sundown without a word of complaint, the woman who was now carrying his child. A wave of emotion so powerful, so overwhelming, it felt like a physical blow, crashed over him. It was not anger or despair. It was a fierce, desperate, heart-cracking love, mixed with a terror and a sense of wonder so profound it brought a hot sting to his eyes. A single tear escaped and traced a path through the grime on his cheek. Then another. He covered his face with his hands, and his shoulders began to shake with silent, racking sobs. He wept. He wept for the men he had lost, for the life he had thrown away, for the emptiness that had been his constant companion for so long. And he wept with a joy so pure and so painful it felt like his heart was being torn open and put back together again, whole and new. He was not just a broken cowboy anymore. He was going to be a father. He had something to fight for that was more real and more important than land or pride or the ghosts of his past. He had a family. The next morning, a different man rode into redemption. The bleakness was gone from his eyes, replaced by a hard, cold fire. Elias, the store owner, met him at the back of the shop, his face etched with worry. "Levi, you need to be careful," Elias whispered, handing him a small sack of provisions he had put aside for them. "The judge has been buying drinks for anyone who will listen. He's offering Holt and some of the others money. He's paying them to run you off your land so he can take Clara back without a fuss." The confirmation of his suspicions settled in Levi's gut like a cold stone. He thanked Elias and walked out into the dusty street. He saw them then. Judge Parker was standing on the boardwalk in front of the saloon, holding court like a king, with Amos Holt and 2 other ranchers at his side. They were laughing, the sound arrogant and cruel. Levi walked directly toward them. The laughter died as he approached. "You've been paying this scum to harass my family," Levi said, his voice low and devoid of emotion. He was not looking at Holt. He was looking directly at the judge. Judge Parker's benevolent smile did not falter. but his eyes grew cold. "My good man, I have no idea what you are talking about. This is a private conversation." "When you threaten what's mine," Levi continued, his voice dropping even lower, "it stops being a private conversation." Amos Holt stepped forward, puffing out his chest. "You'd best watch your mouth. Garrett, you're talking to a judge." "I'm talking to a snake who hides behind a badge," Levi snarled, his control finally snapping. He lunged, not at Holt, but at the judge. His fist connected with Parker's jaw, the crack of bone on bone echoing in the street. The judge staggered back, shock and fury on his face. Before Levi could strike again, Holt and the others were on him. It was a desperate, ugly fight. Levi was strong, but he was outnumbered and worn down. He fought with the fury of a cornered animal, but they wrestled him to the ground, the dust choking him, their fists and boots finding his ribs and his face. Sheriff Calloway arrived to the sight of Levi being held down by 3 men, his face bloodied, his chest heaving. With a weary resignation, the sheriff pulled his pistol. "That's enough," he yelled. He hauled Levi to his feet. "Levi, you're under arrest. Assault!" They dragged him to the small stone jail and threw him in a cell. The iron door clanged shut, the sound a final, definitive note of defeat. Through the bars, Levi could see the judge, dabbing at a cut on his lip with a silk handkerchief, a triumphant smirk on his face. He had won. News traveled fast. A boy from town, paid a few cents by Elias, rode out to the ranch. He found Clara splitting firewood, her movements sure and steady. He breathlessly told her what had happened. She listened, her face pale, her expression unmoving. When he was finished, she simply nodded, thanked him, and went into the cabin. She emerged a few minutes later. She had not changed her torn and dusty work dress. She had not washed the soot from her face, but she had taken her hair down from its bun, and it fell in a wild cascade over her shoulders. In her hands, she carried the rifle Levi had taught her to use. She did not saddle her own mule. She saddled Levi's big roan gelding, the animal sensing her urgency and standing steady for her. She rode for town not with the frantic panic of a victim, but with the cold, deliberate purpose of a warrior. She rode straight to the jail and dismounted, leaving the horse untied in the middle of the street. She walked to the front of the sheriff's office, the rifle held loosely but purposefully at her side. A small crowd, drawn by the earlier fight, began to gather at a safe distance. Sheriff Calloway came out, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "Clara, don't do this. Go home. There's nothing you can do." She ignored him. Her eyes were fixed on the barred window of the cell where she could see Levi's silhouette. "Let him out," she said, her voice not loud, but carrying with an unshakable authority that made the sheriff pause. "I can't do that," he said, his voice hardening. "He assaulted a man, a judge. The law is the law." Clara raised her gaze to meet his. There were no tears, no pleading. There was only a fire so fierce it seemed to burn away all fear. She took a step forward, her knuckles white on the stock of the rifle. "He's mine," she said, each word a stone laid in a foundation of absolute conviction. She took another step. "You'll have to kill me to take him." The words hung in the dusty air, a direct challenge to the law, to the town, to the entire world that had tried to crush her. The sheriff was stunned into silence. The crowd murmured, their curiosity turning to awe. Then, a new voice cut through the tension. "She's telling the truth." All eyes turned. Martha Coulson, the woman who had first judged Clara so harshly, stepped out from the crowd. She walked to stand a few paces behind Clara, her stern face set in lines of grim resolve. She had been in the church. She had heard the sob in Clara's voice and seen the truth in her eyes. "That judge is a liar and a brute," Martha declared, her voice ringing with the authority of a town elder. "And that girl has more decency in her little finger than he has in his whole black-hearted body. The boy is just defending his own." A ripple went through the crowd. Martha's words gave them permission to believe what they had already started to suspect. Another woman stepped forward, then Elias from the general store. A slow, quiet crowd began to form around Clara. Not a mob, but a silent, supportive wall. They were no longer just spectators, they were witnesses. Sheriff Calloway looked at the armed, determined woman in front of him. He looked at the faces of his neighbors, their expressions a mixture of fear and stubborn pride. He looked at the jail, where Levi stood watching, his bloodied face pressed against the bars, and he looked over at the saloon, where Judge Parker was watching the scene unfold with a look of disbelief. Calloway was a man of the law, but he was also a man of the town. He let out a long, weary sigh, the sound of a man who was tired of enforcing a law that felt wrong. He unlocked the cell door and pushed it open. "Get out of here, Levi," he said, not looking at him. Then he turned and walked toward the judge, his hand now resting firmly on his pistol. "Judge Parker, your presence is no longer welcome in Redemption. I suggest you and your carriage be gone by sunset." That night, Levi and Clara rode back to the ranch under a sky full of stars. They were bruised, exhausted, and they had lost almost everything. But they were together, and they were free. As they approached the cabin, they saw a lantern sitting on the porch rail and a folded piece of paper tucked under it. It was a letter from Sarah Blackwood, an older widow who lived on a large, prosperous ranch on the other side of the valley. She was a respected, solitary woman who had kept to herself during the whole affair. The note was short and to the point. "I heard about your barn. A man cannot run a ranch without a barn. Mine is large, and my husband is gone. The north end is empty. You are welcome to it for as long as you have need. Shelter your animals. Shelter yourselves. The world is hard enough without neighbors turning on each other." Later, they walked through the moonlight to the widow's ranch. The barn was magnificent, a cathedral of sweet-smelling hay and dark, weathered timber. It was a place of safety, a place of hope, a place offered in kindness. Clara walked to the center of the empty north end, the moonlight streaming down from the hayloft window, illuminating her face. She looked at Levi, at his battered face, at the fierce love in his eyes. The world had thrown its worst at them, and they were still standing. The memory of her old nightmare felt like a distant echo, a story about someone else. She reached out and took his hand, her voice a soft, intimate whisper that was for him alone. "Make me yours again," she said, her eyes shining with tears that were not of sorrow, but of a love so deep it was a beautiful, searing pain. "Even if it hurts." Fall came on the heels of the summer's heat, a sharp, cold wind that swept down from the mountains and stripped the leaves from the few cottonwood trees that lined the creek. The sky took on a pale, washed-out blue, and the nights grew long and sharp with the promise of frost. The season of hard decisions had arrived. They had been living and working out of Sarah Blackwood's barn, a generous but temporary arrangement. The blackened footprint of their own barn was a constant, grim reminder of how precarious their existence was. The town had settled into a grudging acceptance of them, but the whispers had not died entirely. They were still outsiders, a story to be told, a curiosity. One evening, as they sat by the fire in their small cabin, the wind howling a mournful song around the eaves, Levi finally spoke the words that had been weighing on his mind for weeks. He looked at Clara, at the gentle swell of her belly beneath her worn dress, and his face was a mask of worry. "We could leave," he said, his voice low and rough. "We could sell the land for what little we could get. Head north to Montana, maybe, or west to Oregon. Find a place where nobody knows our names, where we can start over, clean, a place where our child won't have to be born into this fight." He was offering her an escape. He was offering her the peace he thought she deserved, the peace he felt he had stolen from her by bringing her into his troubled life. It was, he believed, the only decent thing left for him to do. Clara listened, her hands resting on her belly, feeling the faint, fluttering promise of the new life within. She looked around the small, rough-hewn cabin. It was not a grand home. It was 4 walls and a roof, a place of ghosts and painful memories. But it was also the place where she had found her voice, where she had been touched with gentleness, where she had been seen for who she truly was. She looked at the man before her, at the deep love and fierce protection in his eyes, a love so strong it was willing to sacrifice the only home he had ever known. And she knew she could not run. "No," she said, her voice soft but absolute. She reached across the small space between them and took his calloused hand. "This is our home, Levi, the ashes out there, this cabin, this land. This is where I stopped being a ghost. This is where I became real." She squeezed his hand, her gaze unwavering. "We stay. They tried to burn us out. They tried to shame us. They tried to break us. We can't let them win. We can't let them think they have the power to erase us. Our child will be born here, and he will know that his parents did not run from the world. They stood their ground and built a life right where they were told they could not. And so, they stayed. They began the slow, back-breaking work of rebuilding. Levi, with the help of Elias and a few other quiet supporters from town, began clearing the wreckage of the old barn. They salvaged what timber they could and began felling new trees, the rhythmic thud of the axe a defiant heartbeat on the cold, autumn air. Clara, her body growing heavier, managed the small homestead, her presence a quiet, constant source of strength. The first snow of the year came early, a silent, swirling curtain of white that transformed the harsh landscape into something soft and pure. It fell on a Saturday, blanketing the half-finished frame of the new barn, hushing the world. That afternoon, they were married. There was no preacher, no church. They stood before the roaring fire in their cabin, the snow falling softly outside the window. Sarah Blackwood was there, her weathered face crinkled into a rare smile, and Elias, his quiet decency, a solid, reassuring presence. They were their witnesses, the sum total of their new, hard-won community. Clara wore a simple dress of blue calico she had sewn herself. Levi wore a clean shirt and a look of such profound reverence it made Clara's heart ache. They did not exchange rings. They exchanged vows spoken in low, simple words, promises not of ease or happiness, but of unwavering solidarity, a promise to stand together, to hold the line, no matter what came. It was a pact sealed not by law or religion, but by fire and snow and shared survival. Their quiet life, however, was not to be left entirely in peace. A few weeks later, as Levi was working on the roof of the new barn, 3 riders approached. It was Amos Holt and 2 of his men, the last bitter dregs of Judge Parker's influence. They had been drinking, and their faces were flushed with a belligerent, resentful courage. "Garrett!" Holt shouted, his voice slurring slightly. "We heard you were rebuilding, wasting your time. This town ain't got room for your kind. You and your whore ought to just keep on moving." Levi's body went rigid. He slowly put down his hammer and began to climb down the ladder, his face a thundercloud of cold fury. He was tired of fighting, but he would never be too tired to defend his wife's honor. He reached the ground, his fists clenched, ready for the inevitable violence. But before he could take a step, the cabin door opened. Clara emerged, her pregnant form silhouetted in the doorway. She held her rifle, the one Levi had taught her to use. She did not raise it. She simply held it cradled in her arms, its presence a calm, undeniable statement. She walked past Levi and stopped a dozen feet from the riders, placing herself directly between them and her husband. She did not speak. She did not have to. Her eyes, clear and steady, met Holt's. There was no fear in her gaze. There was no anger. There was only a profound, unshakable certainty. She was a mountain, and she would not be moved. Holt and his men stared at her. They had come looking for a fight with a man they thought they could break. They had not counted on the woman. They saw her swollen belly, the rifle in her arms, and the absolute resolve on her face. The drunken bravado drained out of them, leaving behind a sour, impotent shame. Holt spat into the dirt, muttered a curse, and wheeled his horse around. His men followed, and they rode away without another word, their retreat a final, pathetic admission of defeat. Clara watched them go, her posture never wavering. Only when they were a distant speck on the horizon did she lower the rifle, a long, slow breath escaping her lips. The baby came early, in the dead of winter, during a blizzard that sealed them off from the rest of the world. The labor was long and difficult, and by the time their son was born, a tiny, fragile creature with a shock of dark hair. Clara was exhausted, but alive. Levi had delivered him, his large, rough hands surprisingly gentle, his face a mask of terror and awe. But their relief was short-lived. The baby was too small. His cries were weak and kittenish, and his breathing was a shallow, labored flutter. The blizzard broke 2 days later, and Levi rode like a madman for the doctor in the next town over. The doctor, a weary man with kind eyes, came and did what little he could. He examined the child, his face growing more grim with each passing moment. He finally turned to them, his expression full of a gentle pity that was more terrifying than any alarm. "He is very weak," the doctor said softly. "His lungs are not ready for this world. Keep him warm, pray, but you should be prepared. He might not make it through the night." The words fell into the small cabin like stones of ice. Prepared. The doctor left, and the silence he left behind was a living, breathing monster. Clara was too weak to rise from the bed. Levi stood by the window, staring out at the stark, white landscape, his shoulders shaking. He could not look at the tiny, struggling life in the cradle. He could not bear it. He walked out of the cabin, out into the biting cold, and sat on a log, his head in his hands, and he wept. He was a man who could face down gunslingers and fires, a man who could rebuild a barn with his bare hands. But he was helpless against this. He could not fight this enemy. He could not protect his son from the fragility of his own small body. Inside, Clara heard his muffled sobs. She looked at her son, his tiny chest rising and falling with a terrifying irregularity. She saw the blue tinge to his lips, and she felt a wave of love so fierce, so powerful. It burned away her own exhaustion and fear. She would not let him go. She would not be prepared. She would fight. She reached into the cradle and lifted the baby, his body shockingly light, and held him against her bare chest, skin to skin, trying to warm him with her own life force. She wrapped them both in every blanket she could reach. She held him close to her heart and bent her head over his, her lips brushing his downy hair, and she began to whisper. She whispered the words that had become her own prayer, her own mantra of survival, transforming them now into a plea, a command, a desperate lullaby for her son. "Don't stop fighting," she whispered, her voice a raw, trembling thread in the quiet room. "Don't stop, even if it hurts." She repeated the words over and over, a prayer against the coming darkness. She poured all of her will, all of her hard-won strength, all of her love into that one simple phrase. She would not let the world erase him. The boy survived the night. When dawn broke, pale and cold, his breathing was a little stronger, his cries a little louder. Levi, his face ravaged by grief and cold, finally came back inside. He saw his wife, asleep from sheer exhaustion, and their son, still alive, still breathing, nestled against her heart. The sight broke him and healed him all at once. He took off his old, worn duster coat, the one that smelled of leather and trail dust, and gently draped it over his wife and child, covering them both in his protection, in his love. The final scene does not take place in the cold of winter, but in the warm, golden light of the following autumn. The rebuilt barn stands tall and proud, its fresh-cut timber smelling of pine and promise. Levi is in the corral, working with a young colt, his movements patient and sure. He is a man at peace with his land, and standing behind the barn, in the exact spot where she had first kissed his scars, is Clara. Strapped to her chest in a sling is their son, a healthy, sturdy boy with his father's dark eyes, gurgling happily as he watches the world. She turns, a gentle, knowing smile on her face, as if seeing a friendly face just beyond the frame of her world. Her thoughts drift back, not to the horror of the judge's study, but to the darkness of the barn loft, to a moment of profound loneliness when she had first whispered a prayer for herself. The memory is no longer a source of pain. It is a milestone, a marker on the long, hard road that had led her here. She looks from her husband to her child, at the life they have built from ashes, and the smile on her face deepens.
It still hurts, she thinks, the memory a faint, silvery scar on her soul, but it is worth it.
Thank you for listening to our story. We encourage you to comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect. Subscribe to our Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts with us in English.